Us back to the UK, where we speak to the Conservative MP, Sir Desmond Swayne. Thank you very much for joining us here on the programme. You're not a big fan of the restrictions, are you? You think the government's overstepped the mark? Why not?
I think the strategy is entirely wrong. There may one day come a virus which threatens our whole way of life, but this isn't it, even if we're behaving as if it were. The reality is that in terms of the UK killers, it's 24th on the list, responsible for only 1.4% of deaths. Yet we're doing huge economic damage and damage to our health in terms of the long-term conditions that are not being diagnosed and not being treated. I'm convinced that the cure is proving worse than the disease itself.
Yesterday, Euronews reported from Sweden, a country which has taken a lot more of a hands-off approach. They've gone for more social distancing, but they've eschewed face masks. People are still allowed to congregate as long as they keep their distance from one another. Is that the type of looser restrictions you'd like to see brought into the UK?
Yes, much more proportionate to the danger. Remember, when Sweden decided not to proceed with lockdowns like the rest of Europe, the British scientists, the Imperial College model, which had predicted 500,000 deaths in the UK, ran its modelling on Sweden and said because they weren't having a lockdown, they would have 85,000 deaths. Well, they had 5,000. I think we've got to be much more sceptical about much of the science that is being served up to us and listen to many more of those other voices in the scientific community that's saying that we're going down the wrong road.
I mean, science is science at the end of the day, and facts are facts. But I just want to stick with the Sweden point for the moment, because what we find is that people in Sweden have been a lot more trusting of their government. They've followed the recommendations to a T. That hasn't been the case in the UK, though. People have been flouting the rules. We've seen lots of raves, people coming back from holiday, not going into quarantine. So can you really apply the Swedish model when you've got a UK population who do not seem compliant?
I think it's a fair point. I think many of the international comparisons that are made are misplaced because you're not comparing like with like. Certainly, yes, the Swedish are much more amenable, and indeed they, 50% of Swedes, I'm told, live on their own anyway. So you've got much less of it. We have many more communities where you've got multiple households, and so there's a lot more mixing anyway. That's the nature of the United Kingdom, but I don't believe that makes it ripe for much more rigorous regulation that causes more deaths and more economic damage in the long run.
So I can tell that you're quite worked up about this. Are you so worked up that you're going to put an amendment in then?
Well, remember, actually, so we've got a debate next week on renewing the coronavirus regulation. But actually, the coronavirus regulations are milk and water. They're quite weak. In fact, they do some quite good things. They've enabled the government to implement a furlough system. The real villain of the piece in the United Kingdom is the 1984 Public Health Act. Years and years ago, Parliament gave huge powers to government to rule by decree, by order in these emergency cases. And it's through that act that most of the harm is being done. And I'm appalled that huge intrusions are being made into our individual liberty. Who we may meet, when we may meet them, what we must wear when we meet them, without any debate in Parliament about the matter at all. Never mind a vote. We're supposed to be a democracy.
And the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson is known, or was known, as a big libertarian, so it must have come as a shock to you to see the sort of change of tack he's been taking, going down the route of now bigger fines. Now, on that, the critics of the UK government say that the coronavirus has really shown that the current Conservative administration is failing. Boris Johnson is at the helm of that. We've seen support for the Tories fall from almost 18 points at the start of March to now just a 3-point lead. Do you think it's time for change at the top? Can you see Boris in his job in place by next year?
No, I can't. I can't see any change at all. I think Boris remains a popular figure, and despite, the reality is, having had to go through lockdowns, having seen unemployment rise, inevitably the Conservative lead was bound to be eroded substantially, not least because there's been a significant change in the leadership of the Labour Party. So I think there are other factors at work here. So I don't see there any threat to Boris. But I take your point that he was never seen as the sort of person who would impose these measures. And frankly, I think he was spooked when Professor Neil Ferguson and the Imperial College model said that if we didn't go into lockdown, we'd have 500,000 deaths. The government changed its strategy and moved into a lockdown. I believe that was a mistake. We should have taken more into account the fact that Professor Ferguson and his modelling has formed. For years, they have predicted, at every opportunity, huge numbers of deaths with every new infection that's come along. And they have been spectacularly wrong on every occasion.
Sir Desmond Swayne, I'm sure that the professor would disagree with you, but thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us here on Good Morning Europe.